um, wildlife wildlife tracking or telemetry methods or things like that. So I'll kind of start off sort of simple just for anyone who doesn't really know a lot about those methods, and then we'll kind of get into the different telemetry methods, tracking methods, and then we'll end with the Motus wildlife tracking system, and that kind of be the bulk of the presentation. And then if we have time, what I'll do is I'll briefly go to the Motus website and kind of show you how interactive everything is, and then kind of see if you wanted to look at a specific station, we can click on the dot and we'll show you the different species and the routes that you can see from the species that have been detected from stations in the state. So with that, my name is Jacob Woulf. I'm the Motus coordinator for Lake Michigan Bird Observatory. I've been in this role for about 2.5 years. It's my first job after graduating. I went to UW Green Bay for quite a few years. I graduated in 2019 with a bachelor's in animal biology, and then again in 2022 with a master's in environmental science. There, I studied movements of piscivorous birds, primarily double-crested cormorant and American white pelican. The picture you see here is one of our test subjects from that study. It's a pelican that had just received a backpack GPS transmitter. I'll actually share a little bit of that research coming up here in a little bit. A lot of cool work there, and fortunate to kind of be able to work on that project. And it was a nice segue into this sort of wildlife tracking project or job that I'm working right now. So when we think of tracking migratory birds, there's kind of four main things that can come to our minds. There are certainly other ways that people track migrating birds, but a couple of the big ones that we think of banding, we think of radar studies and radar movements, we think of GPS transmitters, and then that specialized system for small migratory birds or the Motus wildlife tracking system. But first, we'll look at banding. This method is a very old method and well known. The bird banding has been around for hundreds of years, and likely millions of birds have probably been banded over the course of its lifetime. Um, it's uh, it's a method that's still widely used today. And for those who don't know, it's a small metal band is placed on the leg of the individual, and the band has a specific number, a unique number that lets researchers know exactly what bird this is and where it was originally banded. There are, however, many limitations to this method, and one of them is the recapture probability is very low. So you figure it's the probability of catching one individual bird in a net that's approximately 30 feet wide is low enough to start. But then adding in the fact that this bird has to be captured again to be able to tell where it came from or how many times it was captured again, um, that the probability keeps getting lower and lower every time this bird gets recaptured. So obviously, birds do get recaptured. You need a large sample size to be able to have a good chance at catching birds. I'm not knocking bird banding. There's a lot of good data that has been obtained from bird banding, but that's one of the limitations. Another limitation is it's difficult to photograph or see these band combinations with binoculars. You don't always have to catch these birds in order to figure out where they've been or what bird it is. You can photograph it or use binoculars to see the numbers. But again, it's very difficult, especially the smaller the bird, smaller the numbers, they're moving around a lot. Very difficult to see a full band combination. And lastly, with banding, there's little to no spatial accuracy associated with the track of the bird that's banded. So when a bird gets captured that's banded, researcher will be able to tell, okay, how many stations was this picked up at, or how many banding stations was this captured at, and where did this bird originate from? But you wouldn't necessarily be able to tell the route that this bird took. You certainly wouldn't be able to tell necessarily where it stopped over, unless, of course, it was captured at a banding station at a stopover site. But the detail of the spatial accuracy is typically very low with bird banding itself. Next, we'll take a look at radar. This is a more recent technology that people have been using to kind of document migratory movements of particularly large amounts of birds as they migrate to and from the breeding grounds, typically a high density of birds is needed, and that again indicates a large migratory movement. These spirals that you see here on the map, I forget the exact term they call that. Maybe somebody else knows, but they call them like bird rings or something, or something along those lines. And that's basically them taking off from their roost in every direction, starting to migrate north or south, depending on if it's spring or fall migration. So individualized tracking, for the most part, is impossible. Um, there are some people that can track individuals per se, but they might not be able to tell what species it is. And of course, that's a main part of individualized tracking. So someone might ask, well, what good is this to be able to detect these on radar? Well, one of the things that a lot of cities and ordinances do now is they have a lights out movement. And so these lights out movements help not to disorient birds as they're traveling to and from breeding grounds. A lot of times city lights can disorient them and they come down prematurely and run into windows, and a lot of them end up dying that way. So if researchers or other meteorologists, for example, if they see large scale movements of birds in the southern U.S., then it might be in order to propose one of these lights out ordinances in the following nights to kind of mitigate these birds coming down prematurely and crashing into windows. The next, the next kind of technology that we'll look at here is GPS transmitters, and this is really the best type of technology to use when you're tracking any sort of wildlife, but especially, we're talking about birds here. And that's because there's a high degree of spatial accuracy associated with these GPS transmitters. You get to know exactly where that bird is at exactly a given point in time, which of course is the most ideal for figuring out what route a bird is taking or where that bird is. They also can be programmed to meet the researcher's needs. So a GPS transmitter, for example, if someone's studying whippoorwills, they can set these transmitters to only send locations at night. But the researcher might also be interested in saying, like, well, is this whippoorwill moving around during the day at all? So they can set that transmitter to record maybe once an hour during daylight and then once every 5 minutes at night. So really specific. These transmitters can be programmed to really specific needs. Local and migratory tracking is possible with these. Of course, you know exactly where the bird is at exactly a given point in time. So it doesn't matter if it's local or long distance tracking, both of them will work. And these transmitters are also designed to transmit for the duration of the life of the bird. And that's, of course, theoretical. So if you look at this picture on the right, this is one of our test subjects from Green Bay. This pelican, you can see the transmitter kind of in the upper middle portion of the back. And big portion you see that's black here, that's a solar panel, and that recharges the internal battery. So as long as that transmitter stays on the bird, as long as it has ample sunlight, so it's not obstructed by feathers or debris or mud or anything like that, then theoretically that transmitter will last for the life of the bird. Now, of course, harnesses can weaken over time. Feathers can grow over the transmitter. The bird can take it off if it knows how or it gets agitated by it. So there are a lot of different variables that can affect the duration of the life of the transmitter. But theoretically, they can last a long time. I wanted to share a little bit of data from those transmitters. And before I do that, this project was funded by UW grant when I was at UW Green Bay, and there was also funding provided from USDA. So a lot of different partners on this project. But I'm going to show you a couple different maps, and I mentioned before that local and large scale tracking is possible with these transmitters, and here are two examples of that. So this first map that you see on the left here, these are uh, these are pelican routes as they migrated south from Green Bay. The cutoff line here is Madison, and that's because they travel to the Madison area sometimes during the breeding season. So there's a this would just be a big green blob here in the middle of the state. So you can see these routes that these birds have taken. This is about 22, 23 pelicans that had migrated. You can see most of them wintered in kind of the Louisiana area, some eastern Texas, some in Florida, And then we had a couple that overwintered on the Yucatan Peninsula. This is a cool one because it went through Cuba. And then an example of the more local tracking, these are double-crested cormorant locations during the breeding season in the Green Bay area, and it's a heat map that shows certain hot spots where these birds were spending a lot of the time. The nesting colony was at Cat Island in Lower Green Bay, so that's of course one of the hot spots. And then if you look really close, it's a little bit hard to see, but you can see some of these locations along the bay, along the shore, and then kind of the islands that are off the shore of Door County, and then the Lake Winnebago system as well had quite a few quite a few times where or cormorants were visiting. The last thing I'll share about GPS transmitters is that these transmitters, since they give a lot of locations with a lot of accurate times, it allows for the possibility of detailed animated tracking, so we can display these as animated maps. This video that you're about to see is one pelican on three migratory routes. You'll see first route pop up, that's going to be a fall migration in 2022. You'll see the next route pop up, that's spring migration 23, and then the last route that pops up is fall migration 23. So here we go here. This is the fall migration. You can see a lot of really unique movements, like a figure eight type pattern. And then you can see the spring migration is much quicker than the fall. And then here's the last fall, taking a very similar route to the original fall route, overwintering on the Yucatan Peninsula as well. So again, lots of really cool data that we can get from GPS transmitters. And so that transitions nicely into that specialized system for small migratory birds. And that is the Motus wildlife tracking system. And so before I get into Motus, I wanted to mention some people might ask, well, why don't you just use GPS transmitters all the time? There's two main reasons for that. One is the cost. So GPS transmitters cost about $1,200 a piece, at least they did when I was doing work at UW Green Bay. They could very well be more expensive now. And the Motus transmitters that we'll get into here cost about $200 a piece. So they're six times less expensive. The other is, of course, the size of the bird. So I forget the smallest GPS unit that's being used on birds right now, but it's nowhere near the size to go on, say, like a scarlet tanager that we have here, or a golden winged warbler, or these smaller migratory birds. So we're stuck using a smaller tag. The tag can only be a maximum of 3% of the overall body weight of the bird itself. So you're talking something that's very lightweight for a small bird. So getting into Motus, the Motus Wildlife Tracking System is an international collaborative research effort. It's a network that uses a coordinated automated radio telemetry array to track the movements and behavior of small flying animals. Now, that kind of sounds like a mouthful and it sounds kind of complicated, but it really isn't that complicated. It's a radio technology. And even though the theoretical stuff with radio can be complicated, this technology is actually fairly simple. So all it really entails, and we'll get into more detail about it, but all it really entails is a bird that has a transmitter that emits a radio signal. The transmitter here you can see is about the average size here on the right. It emits a radio signal, and if it flies within range of a Motus station, which is one you can see here on the lower right, and again, I'll have some other examples of other layouts of stations. It flies within range of the station, which approximately 12 miles or so, then the station will log the data that this transmitter is pinging out. So the station will quote unquote know what bird flew past the station. When we talk about Motus stations or Motus towers, I'll say first that a lot of people call them Motus towers, and I I don't want to say I don't like calling them Motus towers, but a lot of times people think like, oh, like a tower, it's going to be the size of a cell tower, which we do have some antennas and stuff mounted on high structures like cell towers, but I like to call them stations because they don't always they're not always these monstrous structures. Sometimes they're only, 10 feet tall if there's a really good field of view around. Sometimes they're 20. Like I said, sometimes they're over 100 feet. It all depends on what we usually have available for the situation and what seems more practical to install if we need it. So again, when I say Motus station, Motus tower, they're kind of interchangeable, but I like using the term Motus station. So the Motus stations have four main components. The first, of course, is the antennas. These are what are listening for the tag frequencies. Um, Next is the receiving module. This is kind of the brains of the operation. This is what's going to store any tag data. The antennas are connected to this module with coaxial cable. And as the transmitter goes by, the antennas pick it up, travels down the coaxial cable, and then it's stored on the module. Or if it's connected to Wi-Fi or a cell network, then the information is automatically uploaded to the Motus database. Also very important is a power source. A lot of our stations can just be plugged into a regular 110-volt wall outlet, but this station here, for example, on Washington Island, that does not have an outlet readily available, so we have to use an off-the-grid type setup for power, and that's just a solar panel with a deep cycle battery and then a charge controller that helps facilitate the charging of the battery. And we've had good luck with those, even in the winter. It seems that the battery stays pretty well charged, and the station doesn't pull a lot of power either, so it seems to work pretty well. And then lastly is the mounting structure. And as you can kind of see in different pictures here, the mounting structure varies greatly depending on the site. Sometimes it's a guide tower, like you can see here. This is our Washington Island station. This is a 10-foot tripod tower and a 20-foot telescoping mast. This picture here, all the way on the right, is actually a modified light pole that we poured a concrete footing for, and then had some anchor bolts and placed the station on top of that footing. So it really depends on the site. A lot of times, if there's a structure available to mount the antennas to, we use that because it saves money and it saves time, it saves having to put in a whole new structure. But if there isn't one available, then we kind of look at the site, we see what's available, we see what we need to do to kind of get above the tree line, or if we can't get above the tree line, then point them in directions that there are gaps in the trees. So mounting structure is, of course, very important. Um, so we need something to put those antennas on. We'll look at the Motus transmitters next. And so there are two frequencies of transmitters that are generally used in North America when we're talking about the Motus wildlife tracking system. And because of that, I'll kind of go back a second, but you can see there's actually two different types of antennas on these stations. So again, our Washington Island station, you can see it the best. You can see there's two smaller antennas. Those are 434 megahertz, listening for 434 megahertz frequencies. And then these big antennas are 166 megahertz, are listening for the 166 megahertz frequency. So with those two antennas, they're listening for the two different frequencies of tags used in North America. The sizes range from about 0.2 grams to any size. But again, if cost isn't an issue, if you start getting into the size range where you could be using a GPS transmitter, you might as well use those GPS transmitters because the data is just so much more robust. Similar to the GPS transmitters, the Motus tags to a degree can be programmed to meet a researcher's need. So that primarily boils down to how often that tag is going to pulse. Um, One limitation to the GPS transmitter or to the Motus tags is that most of them do not have a solar panel to recharge. So they have a battery life that has a declining life as time goes on. So if you have a small bird and you have a tag that pulses very frequently, the life of that transmitter is going to be pretty short. And so you might not be able to get the data that you want to get from it. So the researcher kind of has to balance what kind of species they're working with, kind of has to balance, how long do we want this project to last, to take into account all these things so that the transmitter can last as long as they need to for their specific project. And I think I mentioned it earlier, but the maximum detection range, or the average maximum detection range, is probably about 12 miles in the direction that the antennas are facing in. There's a lot of variables that kind of contribute to these detection ranges. So sometimes being over water helps the station detect transmitters better. Sometimes it hurts it. If there's cell towers nearby, sometimes that can reduce the detection radius of a station. There's a lot of different variables that can make a situation more noisy for the antennas to the antennas can have a more difficult time listening for these tags in certain situations. But this depiction down here kind of gives a good representation of the Motus wildlife tracking system. So you can see you got a Motus tower here on the left side of that picture with a tag. You got bird here. It shows kind of where the tag is generally situated. And then as this bird goes from station to station or flies within range of station to station, then that information is logged and you can kind of get a migratory path from these individuals. And of course, the 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 more stations that are out there, the more chance the bird has of flying by one, and then the higher chance you get of a more spatially accurate path that the bird has taken. I'll say quick too that a lot of times, or most times, these transmitters are used with birds, but they're starting to use them on insects now. So butterflies, dragonflies. Some people use them for like reptile tracking for turtles, for example. So it's not exclusive to birds, but primarily birds are are the group of species that researchers are targeting with these transmitters. So when we think about setting up Motus stations, especially for our organization, and we think about the overall Motus project, um, the first main step that we have in establishing a Motus station is looking for project partners. This is the most important aspect of the Motus project, especially for us because as an observatory, we do not own any property. We don't own land. So we have approximately 27 Motus stations installed through our organization, and all of those, since we don't own any land, all of those are made possible because of partnerships that the organization has. And so without these partners, none of these stations would be able to be installed. Um, and again, just looking for those sites that will be willing to host a station. A lot of times we search out schools, we search out for scientific organizations because a lot of these entities are interested themselves in Motus stations and migratory bird tracking. So we kind of have an in there already. Next, once we have those partnerships established, then we're looking at installing the receivers or the Motus stations themselves. The biggest component, as I'm sure people would be aware of, is the funding aspect of the stations. Generally, the stations cost about $5,000 to $6,000 a piece, so they're pretty expensive. The antennas are specialized equipment, so that's expensive. The receiving module is sort of specialized too, and that's expensive. Basically, every aspect of it is expensive. So that's kind of the next really most important thing. A lot of times the host sites that we have some a lot of times they have some funding available or they know of people that would be interested in funding these stations, which is always nice because then it's less work for us trying to raise these funds for the stations. And then we're also kind of looking, once we have the partners established, we're looking to best establish these fence lines to ensure coverage. And I'll get into that in the next slide or so. But lastly, once the partnerships are established and once the receivers are installed, then we can really start to look at deploying tags, which us as an organization, that's what we're doing. This year, we're beginning our tagging project of purple martins, and we're only deploying 5 transmitters, 5 Motus tags on birds this year, but we're really starting to pursue funding for next field season to deploy as many tags as possible on purple martins, and we'll get into that here in just a second. But Motus tags and tagging projects have to be connected to a very specific scientific research question. A bander can't just say, "Well, I want to, put some tags on like wood thrush tomorrow and then hermit thrush the next day." And you kind of have to have a very specific research question and reason for tagging a specific species. The banders also have to be specially trained. So not only do they have to be a permitted bander, but they also have to have some extra credentials to make sure that these people are qualified to put on these additional markers or additional tags on the birds. And then special permissions, whether it might be local, it might be at a government level, special permissions are typically needed in order to put these transmitters on the birds. Um, I'll show quick. This is just a very small section of the partnerships that we have Motus stations on in affiliation with. So you can see that I only have one page here. It would probably fill up three at least of the partnerships that have worked with us in the past. But again, it just makes all of this possible. You can see Urban Ecology Center down here. They do have a Motus station at the Riverside Park location. This is kind of this map here. It's kind of a mess, and it's not any sort of scientific map, but this is kind of a map that helps me see where the stations are installed. The different colors mean different progress on each of the stations. So all these purple locations are stations that we have installed. The green ones are stations that we have permission to install, but they're either waiting on funding, sometimes they're waiting on equipment for the install, and then kind of these blue ones are sites that they've had interest from, but we don't really have permission from. So you can kind of see that what we're trying to do here is we're trying to cover most of the western shore of Lake Michigan, which we're doing very well at so far. But then we're also trying to build out these transects east to west across Wisconsin to sort of make these invisible fence lines of sorts to try to make it impossible for a tagged individual to travel through the state and not get detected. So current status, these yellow dots, it's at the continental level. This kind of shows you where all of the stations are located across the world. You can see by far North America has the most. And so we'll zoom in there and you can see within North America, um, the northeastern United States, and I guess southeastern Canada too, they have a lot of stations installed. Canada was the Birds Canada was the organization that sort of began this Motus wildlife tracking system. So they're kind of the furthest along with installing Motus stations and having Motus projects. But if we zoom into Wisconsin, now this picture you see here, this was 2019. Um, Actually, no, it was 2023, early 2023. This map shows what Wisconsin looked like with Motus stations then. And then this picture up to date shows now the number of Motus stations that we have in Wisconsin. So we're really starting to build out these stations. Most of the stations you see in Wisconsin are ours. The Illinois-Wisconsin border, that's a collaborator in Illinois that has completed that fence line. But all the other stations that you see in Wisconsin, most of those are ours. The current project that we're just about wrapped up with, we have one station to move and one more new station to install. Is the Lake Michigan project that I referenced a couple slides ago, and this, of course, focuses on installing stations along the western shore of Lake Michigan to get as much coverage as possible along that shoreline. The two stations we have left are one at Barkhausen Waterfowl Preserve in the Swamico area, and then the other one is going to be at the new zoo in the Swamico area as well. But once those two are installed, then that project is over with. All these stations were from a Sustain Our Great Lakes grant that we received, and it provided funding for I want to say it's 15 stations. It's between 14 and 16, but a lot of stations that were provided from the funds there. And then I mentioned about the tagging that we're starting here at Lake Michigan Bird Observatory. The focus is on purple martins. It's a species of special concern. A lot of people are um, unfamiliar with their kind of their breeding habits. So especially on the eastern part of the United States, I believe all of them require human-made houses in order to reproduce. There are no populations that I know of that are breeding in natural cavities. Out west, that's a different story. They're breeding still in natural cavities and natural colonies. But on the eastern side of the Mississippi, I believe it's exclusively human-made nest boxes that they rely on. So it's a little bit scary to think that they are relying completely on us now, but it's a very unique species, and there's a lot to learn about the species, and we have a good network of collaborators who work with purple martins that will be helping us uh, capture the birds, put transmitters on them, and kind of get our research project going with that. So that concludes the kind of the Motus description component of the talk. And so if we have a little time here, I'll go to the Motus Wildlife Tracking website and we can look at that. But first, I want to ask, I went through a lot of information. If anybody has any questions about Motus components, Motus tags, anything like that, I'd be happy to answer them now if you have them.
When you build a partnership, are they responsible for funding the receivers, or how does that work?
Not necessarily. We don't make it a prerequisite. It certainly helps a lot, but it's not a requirement for them to contribute funding.
Cool, thank you.
Now, can people? I don't know if this shared, but can people see my Internet Explorer screen, or do I have to reshare that?
I think you might need to reshare. We see the Motus walkthrough with the link.
Okay, so I will reshare then. Okay, so all this is it's motus.org, MOTUS. A lot of times people ask what modus means. It's derived from Latin word meaning movement. So that's what that means. Motus.org, very simple. And once you get to the website here, and I'll start off by saying that the website seems to have been more user friendly before they did this update. It's a little bit more confusing now, um, which I'm not sure exactly why that's the case, but it seems a little bit more difficult to actually find the find the tracks that you're looking for. Um, so what we'll do here is we'll click on a station like Washington Island here. If you just hover over it, you'll see that it'll show you the number of animals that have been detected and the number of species that have been detected. And if you click on that and you click on View Station, this will kind of give you an idea of uh, it'll give you the idea of the species that have been detected and when they were last detected and so on. So if we uncheck the animals detected box and check that again, this will kind of show up, or this will show the tracks of the individuals that have been detected there. So one of the coolest ones I think is this short-billed dowitcher that was tagged up in Churchill, Manitoba, and so we detected that bird on at Washington Island in 2023, and it ended up being detected all the way down here in Georgia, and then it looks like it was also detected um, up here on the eastern coast of the U.S. So lots of really cool information that we can get from these tagged birds. Another one that I wanted to show you guys, birds that have some really cool migratory routes that we end up picking up a lot of, is Swainson's thrushes. Um, I'll zoom in here. Like I said, you can see it's a little bit more difficult to go back and forth between stations. Um, let's see. Let's go to. I think it's going to be under this one. Yes. So you can see this Swainson's thrush will uncheck some of these boxes, so it'll be easier to see. Let's do that again. So you can see really cool information and really cool migratory routes that these birds are taking. So this bird was tagged near Vancouver, British Columbia, and a lot of the birds that we pick up, a lot of the Swainson's thrushes that we pick up are from kind of that same area, and they make these huge kind of dog-legging migratory paths. And it seems like as soon as they hit the Great Lakes region or thereabouts, they head straight south. And so it's really neat to see um, where these birds have, of course, been tagged, and then where they're being picked up on the wintering grounds. But lots of cool information. The I was just chatting with Amanda before, and Urban Ecology Center, of course, does have a Motus station. It only so far has detected one bird, which I'm a little bit surprised at. But again, there's a lot of variables that can impact the detection range of the stations, and of course, we don't even know if there's a lot of tagged birds that are flying by the station because you need that to be able to detect birds. So if we click on that, you can see that this was a sharp-shinned hawk that was tagged at Cedar Grove. Um, it was picked up at Urban Ecology Center, and then also it was picked up at that Pratt Elementary School. But then there's some wintering data associated with that down here in Florida. And then it was back in Wisconsin earlier this year, which is really cool to see. We had it on our Oconto station, and then we had it on our crossroads at Big Creek Station in Sturgeon Bay. So really cool to see. And even though this is the only bird that has been detected at Urban Ecology Center, and it's a local bird, the migratory path that we were able to get from it and see from it, it's really cool, and it's a really cool project to be a part of, and to see how these birds are moving. So that's kind of the general overview of the website. It's very simple. You don't need a special membership in order to view these things. Some projects are a little bit more private and they don't always share data. Most aren't like that, but a lot of them are very open about data and it's readily accessible to the public, which is nice because the public, of course, are a lot of the people that are going to be contributing to Motus, whether it's through funding or host sites or things like that. So it's neat to have all this at your fingertips. Um, it again, pretty simple to navigate the website. You can see the different stations. You can see if there's one near you and see what has been detected. So I guess, are there any questions with the Motus website, or are there any locations that people want me to look at if they're familiar with specific locations?